In this chapter, we'll be exploring the respiratory system. We'll begin by taking a look at the anatomy of the respiratory system, and then get into some physiology with pulmonary ventilation and examination of gas exchange and transport. Breathing represents life. If you think about it, the first breath of a newborn baby and the last gasp of a dying person are two of the most traumatic moments in the human experience. Why do we need to breathe? Well, the answer lays in the process of producing ATP. All of our body processes, directly or indirectly, require ATP. And ATP synthesis requires oxygen and produces carbon dioxide. This, of course, drives the need to breathe, that is, to take in oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide. The respiratory system essentially consists of a system of tubes that deliver air to the lungs. Oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses out of it. However, the respiratory system works very closely with the cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen to the tissues as well as remove the carbon dioxide. Jointly, they're considered as the cardiopulmonary system. If there's a disorder in the lungs, it's directly going to affect the heart and the circulatory system, and vice versa. The respiratory system also works in conjunction with the urinary system to regulate the body's acid-base balance. As we'll see, the production of carbon dioxide produces hydrogen ions, which change the pH of the blood. So it's important that we have a means to regulate the acid-base balance. So respiration has three meanings. First of all, there's ventilation in the lungs, or breathing. Then there's the process of gas exchange between the air and the blood, and then the blood and the tissue fluid. And thirdly, there's the use of oxygen in cellular metabolism, in the process of cell respiration, which produces the ATP in the mitochondria. So other than bringing air into the body and expelling it from the body, the respiratory system has a much broader range of functions. It's involved in speech and other vocalizations. The rush of air through our nasal passages allows us to have a sense of smell. And as I just mentioned, it affects the pH of body fluids during the elimination of CO2. The respiratory system also has an effect on blood pressure because the lungs carry out a step in the synthesis of a vasoconstrictor called angiotensin II. As we've already seen, breathing creates the pressure gradients between the thorax and the abdomen that promotes the flow of lymph and venous blood back towards the heart. In addition, the respiratory system can be used to help us expel abdominal contents. The Valsalva maneuver is when we hold our breath in order to assist the process of defecation, childbirth, or urination. So the principal organs of the respiratory system are the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and lungs. Incoming air stops in the alveoli of the lungs. The alveoli are microscopic air sacs with very thin walls. There are millions of them. And they function in exchanging gases with the bloodstream through the alveolar wall. And then the air flows back out of the lungs. The division of the lungs that is just about air passages is called the conducting division. It's how we conduct the air into the lungs. There's no gas exchange in any of these tubes. So the conducting division reaches from the nostrils through the major bronchioles. The respiratory division is where we actually see gas exchange. It consists of the alveoli and some other regions of gas exchange in the distal respiratory tract. Well, we divide the respiratory tract into two portions. There's the upper respiratory tract, which is in the head and neck. So it includes the nose, the pharynx, and the larynx. The lower respiratory tract includes all the organs of the thorax, so the trachea and the lungs. We might refer to upper respiratory tract infections or lower respiratory tract infections. So the upper respiratory tract would be things like sinus infections and sore throats. And lower respiratory tract infections would be things like a deep cough that involves the lungs. So let's begin by looking at the nose. The nose functions in warming, cleansing, and humidifying the inhaled air. It also detects odors in the airstream and serves as a resonating chamber that amplifies our voice. The nose extends from the nostrils, or the nares, to a pair of posterior openings called the posterior nasal apertures, or choanae. The facial part of the nose is shaped by bone and hyaline cartilage. The upper portion, composed of the two nasal bones and the maxilla, the inferior half, is composed of the lateral and alar cartilages that you can see here in this figure. The ala nasi is the flared portion at the lower end of the nose. It's shaped by the alar cartilages as well as dense connective tissue. The nasal cavity itself is divided into right and left halves, or two nasal fossae. The nasal septum divides this cavity. It's composed of bone as well as hyaline cartilage. As you'll recall, the vomer, one of our facial bones, forms the inferior part of this septum, and the superior portion is formed by the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. There are also septal cartilages that form the anterior portion in front of those bones. The ethmoid and sphenoid bones form the roof of the nasal cavity, and the hard palate forms the floor. You remember that the hard palate are from the palatine processes of the maxillary bone. It separates the nasal cavity from the oral cavity and allows you to breathe while you're chewing food. The paranasal sinuses and the nasolacrimal ducts from the orbits drain into the nasal cavity. This is why when we cry, we can get a runny nose. At the beginning of the nasal cavity, the space is called the vestibule. This area is lined with stratified squamous epithelium. There are stiff guard hairs called vibrissae that block insects and debris from entering the nose. Posteriorly, the nasal cavity has three folds of tissue that are supported by bone: the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae, or the turbinates. They project from the lateral walls and move towards the septum. They create a meatus, or narrow air passage, beneath each concha. The narrowness and turbulence ensure that most air contacts mucous membranes before it enters the rest of the respiratory system. This is how we clean, warm, and moisten the air. The olfactory epithelium is the portion that detects odors. It covers a small area of the roof of the nasal fossa and adjacent parts of the septum and superior concha. The ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. In the olfactory epithelium, the cilia are immobile and serve to bind odor molecules. The rest of the nasal cavity is lined with respiratory epithelium, except for the vestibule. This is ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium with goblet cells that also secrete mucus. Again, the cilia are motile. The rest of the nasal cavity, except the vestibule, is covered by respiratory epithelium. This is ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium with goblet cells that secrete mucus. The cilia are motile. So while the goblet cells are secreting mucus, the cilia are propelling that mucus posteriorly towards the pharynx, which is then swallowed, and then the mucus and any of its content is destroyed in the digestive tract. There's also an extensive venous plexus in the inferior conchae that forms erectile tissue. Every 30 to 60 minutes, the erectile tissue on one side will swell with blood. This restricts airflow through that fossa. Most of the air will then be directed through the other nostril and fossa. This allows the engorged side time to recover from the drying of air passing over it. Once it has become swollen, the membranes will be moistened. The flow of air shifts between the right and left nostrils, either once or twice an hour. This is an image showing the upper respiratory tract. You can see the superior, middle, and inferior conchae with their linings that will swell. You can see the vestibule and the guard hairs, the nostril. We notice that the hard palate is here, separating the nose from the oral cavity. So now let's move down into the pharynx and larynx regions of the respiratory tract. Here's the pharynx, and then the larynx down here where the vocal cords are. The pharynx, or the throat, is a muscular funnel that extends about 13 centimeters from the choanae, the back of the nose, to the larynx. There are three major regions: the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, and the laryngopharynx. The nasopharynx is posterior to the nasal apertures and above the soft palate. It receives the auditory tubes and contains the pharyngeal tonsil. It has a 90-degree turn that traps large particles. The velocity of the large particles can't make the turn, so they get trapped by the pharyngeal tonsil. The oropharynx is the space between the soft palate and the epiglottis, and it contains the palatine tonsils. Lower down, we have the laryngopharynx. The laryngopharynx runs from the epiglottis to the cricoid cartilage, which is where the larynx begins. In the nasopharynx, we'll see pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and only air passes over that surface. However, in the oropharynx and laryngopharynx, we'll see that not only air passes, but food and drink also pass across it. Thus, it's going to be lined by stratified squamous epithelium. As we move further down the respiratory tract, we move into the larynx. The larynx is the voice box. It's only about 4 centimeters long, and it's basically a cartilaginous chamber. Its primary function is to keep food and drink out of the airway, but it's also involved in phonation, the production of sound. So let's begin by looking at the epiglottis. The epiglottis is a flap of tissue that guards the superior opening of the larynx. At rest, it stands up almost vertically, but during swallowing, the extrinsic muscles of the larynx pull the larynx upward, and the tongue pushes the epiglottis down to meet it. So not only do we have the epiglottis flap closing over the respiratory pathway, but we have the larynx moving up to meet it. This closes the airway and directs food into the esophagus behind it. There are several vestibular folds in the larynx. They play a big role in keeping food and drink out of the airway. But also, in humans, they've evolved an additional role in making sound. Here are 3 different views of the larynx. We have the anterior view, a posterior view, and then a medium view. We can see all the different cartilages that compose the larynx. There are 9 cartilages. 3 of them are relatively large and solitary. We'll see the epiglottic cartilage, which is this flap here that covers the glottis. It's a spoon-shaped supportive plate inside the epiglottis. It's the most superior of all 3 cartilages. Then we see the thyroid cartilage right here. This is also known as the Adam's apple, or the laryngeal prominence. It's the largest of them. It's shield-shaped. And in men, it grows much larger. That's because it's stimulated by testosterone. The 3rd major cartilage is the cricoid cartilage. It connects the larynx to the trachea. And you can see that here. So those are our first 3 major cartilages. Then we have 6 others, which are in pairs. So really there's only 3. The first 2 are the arytenoid cartilages. The arytenoid cartilages are posterior to the thyroid cartilages. You can see them right here. On top of each, there's a little corniculate cartilage. These are like a pair of little horns. The 3rd ones are the cuneiform cartilages. The cuneiform cartilages you can just see in this median view. They support the soft tissue that are between the arytenoids and the epiglottis. So take a moment here to quickly outline the different cartilages in the larynx. There are 9, 3 singular and 3 paired. So the walls of the larynx are actually quite muscular. There are some deep intrinsic muscles that operate the vocal cords, and then there are superior extrinsic muscles that connect the larynx to the hyoid bone. These are the muscles that elevate the larynx during swallowing to allow the epiglottis to seal off the gap. The interior wall has two folds on each side. We have a larger fold and a smaller fold. They extend from the thyroid cartilage in the front to the arytenoid cartilages at the back. There's a pair of superior vestibular folds. These ones play no role in speech, but they are involved in closing the larynx during swallowing. These inferior vocal cords, or vestibular folds, are the ones that produce sound when air passes between them. They contain the vocal ligaments. They're covered with stratified squamous epithelium, which is best suited to endure the vibration and contact between the cords as they produce sound. The glottis is the space. It's the hole through the middle of these vestibular folds. Hence the epiglottis, the on top of the glottis, being the flap that covers this hole. Here is an endoscope picture of the vocal cords themselves in the larynx. The space here is the glottis. The epiglottis we can just see in the top of the screen. So the big question then is, how do the vocal cords make sound? And that's because of their intrinsic muscles. These intrinsic muscles pull on the corniculate and arytenoid cartilages, causing them to pivot. So you can see in these two figures here, basically these two muscles between the arytenoid and cricoid cartilage will pull on the arytenoid cartilage and pivot it, thus drawing the cords wide. And then another pair of little muscles that go between the arytenoid cartilage and the cricoid cartilages will pull that gate closed again. This pivoting of the cartilages causes abduction or adduction of the vocal cords, depending on the direction of the rotation. Air is forced between these adducted vocal cords and vibrates them. This produces a high-pitched sound when the cords are taut and a lower-pitched sound when they're more relaxed. The adult male vocal cords are usually longer and thicker, so they vibrate more slowly, and thus they produce a lower-pitched sound. The loudness of the sound produced by our vocal cords is determined by the force of the air passing between the cords. Now, the vocal cords on their own produce very crude sounds. They're not formed into words at all. They're sort of a liken to a hunter's duck call. These crude sounds are formed into words by the actions of the pharynx, the oral cavity, the tongue, and the lips. So our language is very complex, anatomically speaking. So pull out a piece of paper and put your pen on it and see if you can write down in your own words how the vocal cords work. Just spend about a minute on it, and then review some notes and figure it out, and maybe rewrite that little paragraph. And we'll see you in the next section for the lower respiratory anatomy.